He's also the author of this book, The 10 Things You Can't Say in America.
So that means we're going to have a short conversation. We can't say them.
Well, I think you probably will. What led to the book?
Just sort of an overall being fed up with political correctness, being fed up with, I thought, was an unfair debate on, for example, gun control, an unfair debate on the so-called healthcare crisis, a feeling that when you really look at the party platforms of both the Democratic and the Republican Party, both in the year 2000 seek to expand the scope and power of the federal government, which I think is inconsistent with what the Founding Fathers envisioned. I'm fed up with black leaders and black people blaming racism for all manner of problem in the black community. I'm fed up with what I call white condescension, and it's the failure of whites to apply the same standards of civility to blacks and to others as they apply to themselves. The book really is a wake-up call, I think, to America. Let's recheck our assumptions and let's get down to the original principles of the Founding Father, which was a limited government, a government that stays out of our wallets and out of our bedrooms.
Why, as you suggest, have people thought over the years these are things that you can't say?
Well, by that I mean obviously you can say them.
Sure.
We're going to talk about them. But I mean if you do, you're likely to be severely criticized. And not just criticized on the basis of your logic or your reasoning, but on the basis of your motives. The first chapter is Blacks Are More Racist Than Whites. And I think I lay out a pretty persuasive case that in the year 2000, white racism is hardly the #1 problem facing the black community, but many black leaders insist that it is. And rather than say, well, Larry, you're wrong, here's why, I'm called a whole bunch of names, many of them I have in the book, Lou, Uncle Tom, bootlicking Uncle Tom, a sellout, an Oreo, as in brown on the outside, white on the inside, rather than to deal with the merits of the debate. I'm from California. And recently in California, the voters passed Proposition 209 to rid race and gender-based preferences. A local college, Cal State Northridge, wanted to host a debate, and they invited a prominent civil rights activist to debate the pro-affirmative action side. Whom did they ask to come to debate the anti-affirmative action side? David Duke. Therefore, if you are opposed to affirmative action, as I am, you are David Duke-like. I contacted the university. I offered myself to be that debate opponent, and they rejected me. And I think they did so because they wanted to brand anybody who's opposed to affirmative action with the brush of being a bigot. And these are the kinds of things that I mean. State Senator Diane Watson, during the 209 debate, she happens to be a black woman, blasted Ward Connerly, a black man who spearheaded the movement. Ward Connerly happens to be married to a white woman. And she said, the reason you are in favor of affirmative action, is against affirmative action, is you have no ethnic pride. You're married to a white woman. You want to be white. That's why you are in favor of this proposition. Diane Watson is now ambassador to Micronesia. She never apologized. Indeed, when reporters asked her about it, she defiantly said, that's right, I said it. I don't take it back. Black politicians make statements like this all the time. Charlie Rangel in New York said at the 1994 Republican Congress, they don't say spick or nigger anymore. They just say, let's cut taxes. I once debated Julianne Malveaux, a prominent columnist with USA Today, and I told her, we must get away from this incessant search for the great white bigot and concentrate on real problems, problems with schools, problems of drugs, problems of the lack of job formation in the inner city. So we've got to stop this incessant search for the great white bigot. And she said, no, Larry, there is no great white bigot. There are about 200 million little white ones. And I have a collection of statements like that made by very prominent Americans who ought to know better. Yet the media does not seem to, in my opinion, apply the same standard as they would if a white person were to say that. The campaign manager of Al Gore, Donna Brazile, said of the Republican Party, they are the party of the white boys. Now, I submit to you, if anybody in the Republican Party made that accusation about the Democratic Party, which arguably is more accurate, since about 85% of Democrats vote for, blacks vote for the Democratic Party, they would have had to apologize immediately, perhaps even have to resign. Yet she never apologized, she never backed down from the statement. It was horrific. And so, Lou, that chapter has a collection of statements made by that, books that have been written by very prominent writers, including one in California who wrote a book called The Assassination of the Black Male Image, where he argued that the media intentionally puts the worst possible images on, presumably to make black people look bad, when in fact the opposite is true. If you look at the primetime lineup in movies, a black person is more likely to be perceived as a doctor, lawyer, dentist, or professional than is in real life, and is less likely to be perceived as a street criminal than is the case in real life. So these are the kinds of things that I mean when I say blacks are more racist than whites. I gave a speech recently at the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League. Good news, they commissioned a poll and found anti-Semitism in America at an all-time low, around 9%. But in the black community, anti-Semitism was about 4 times higher.
Larry Elder is the author of this book, The 10 Things You Can't Say in America. He's the host of the Larry Elder Show on KABC Radio in Los Angeles. Also a syndicated columnist, publishes a monthly newsletter called The Elder Statement. With us until about the top of the hour to talk about this book and the 10 things you can't say in America. You mentioned, you talked earlier about the opening chapters on racial issues, but you also write about policy issues because one of the chapters is called The Big Lie, Our Healthcare Crisis.
That's right. Again, getting back to the principles of the Constitution, there's nothing in the Constitution that gave the federal government the power to take over health care. Indeed, when FDR began to pass a lot of New Deal legislation to combat the Depression, which, by the way, did not succeed in eliminating the Depression, it was the dismantling of protection legislation following the Second World War. When we first began to push for some of this very, very expansive legislation, the Supreme Court rejected it. One after another of these laws were sued, and on appeal, the Supreme Court said, I'm sorry, you may be very well intentioned, and these may even work, but the Constitution does not provide for this kind of power in the government. FDR was so ticked off, he threatened to add 3 more members of the Supreme Court, and that put pressure on one of them to switch, and only then did this New Deal legislation get passed. What I'm saying is, I don't believe the Founding Fathers allowed for Party A, who needs health care, to get the money from Party B. The Founding Fathers felt that you ought to attain personal responsibility for your own lives, and that includes education, it includes welfare, it includes all sorts of things. Moreover, it doesn't work. Look at what's going on in Canada. And when Hillary Rodham Clinton was pushing for Clinton Care, she likened the Canadian system to the system that she hoped that we would have. Well, look at what's going on in Canada. There are a lot of people that are very unhappy. People are coming over the border for cutting-edge technology. They're just now getting MRIs. It's led to inefficiencies. It's led to waste. It's led to long lines. Socialism doesn't work. Medical care is a very complicated proposition. Do you want the same people who are running the post office to run medical care? In the 1965, they passed the Medicare Act. In the 20 years preceding Medicare, Lou, the average stay in a hospital increased 3-fold. In the 20 years following Medicare, the average stay in a hospital increased 8-fold. It is making our health care less accessible, not more expensive, not less, and less innovative, not more.
Larry Elder with us until the top of the hour. Our first call for him is Washington, D.C. Good morning.
Yes, and I hope you allow me, I'll try to be as quick as I can, and allow me a follow-up if we have time, because I want Mr. Elder to answer these 4 things directly. Number one, when it comes to the Founding Fathers, sir, number one, it was written by white males who didn't even think we were human, number one.
Well, of course that's true. So what? What's your point?
So, point is...
We should ignore it? We should ignore it?
Praise them, sir, as if they're infallible, and they're not. Okay, they made mistakes, too.
Do you mean they made a mistake in not allowing for an expansive federal government? Is that what you mean?
No, sir, I'm not talking about an expanded federal government. I'm talking about the treatment of blacks as humans.
Well,
sir,
if you want to make an argument that the Constitution treated us as less than humans, you win the debate. I'm not arguing that. If you want to make the argument that slavery was a stain on America, you're right. I mean,
sir,
this is the year 2000.
Okay, sir, this is my dime. And see, and I want you to react like you're reacting right now.
Well, I'm trying to respond. I'm trying to respond to you.
All black people. No, wait, listen, sir.
I think, Lou, you see why these are 10 things you can't say in America.
Okay.
No. That's not what I'm doing.
Go ahead, DC.
You're not going to get me in that little trick bag. Okay. What I'm saying is, a lot of the things you're saying, I believe too. But don't be ignorant to the fact that there are still racist white men who control the power, like a Rush Limbaugh, who said on his radio show that Tiger Woods, that because the white male should be the ones who should be able to beat Tiger Woods because they are superior. He said that on his radio show, sir.
Boy,
thanks a lot.
I don't know how to respond to somebody telling me that Rush Limbaugh is a racist and is some sort of formidable force that we must reckon with, and with the remark that Tiger Woods should be beaten by a white man. When someone makes remarks like that, I would think that you ought to get up in the morning and do what you have to do, kiss your children, make sure that they've been fed and clothed and educated, and go on about your business. These are, assuming he said it, they're silly little irritating remarks that ought not ruin your day.
That first call on our line for Democrats. On the line for Republicans is Marlton, New Jersey. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. I would like to just commend Larry Elder for his courage to take a stand for right instead of correctness in this day and age, and to make a statement about the gun control that's in so much in the news today. A generation ago, just a generation ago, you and I was 45, could I'm 45 now, could order any kind of gun virtually you wanted from a Sears Roebuck catalog, and these sadistic things were never heard of. And now, just one generation later, with the most stringent gun control laws we've ever heard of, and more on the books, more to come, this violence is growing and growing and growing. And I would like for him to continue his good work at this. I don't understand how the liberals can take a stand of more stringent gun control when you could order it and nothing was ever done. None of these violent things were ever considered or heard of. And I would like I just want to tell him I really thank him for the good work and to keep trying to tell the truth.
Thank you very much.
This chapter is called Gun Control Advocates, Good Guys with Blood on Their Hands.
Right.
It's one of the 10.
That's what the caller was referring to. I find it fascinating when you have a debate with somebody who wants more gun control legislation, whether it's Rosie O'Donnell or Sarah Brady of Handgun Control, Inc., and you ask the question, Lou, how often do Americans use guns for defensive purposes every year? We know 20,000 Americans die because of guns, but how often are Americans' lives saved as a result of their ability to get a gun? And according to John Lott, author of a very, very good book called More Guns, Less Crime, which I would urge anybody who thinks more gun control legislation is the way to go to read, he estimates that 2.5 million Americans every year use guns for defensive purposes. Now, out of that figure, criminologist Gary Kleck from Florida estimates that 400,000 Americans use the gun because they thought they were in fear of losing their lives. Now, I have no problem with somebody saying, well, I don't buy the numbers, I'm suspicious, but to have a debate and not even know the other side of the equation. I have on my show once a month the police chief of Los Angeles, Bernie Parks, and he supports further gun control legislation. I asked him that question. How often, Chief, do guns save lives? He says, I don't know. I said, what's your estimate? He said, I don't know. I said, you don't even have a guess? He says, no. I said, is it relevant? He says, no. And I said, with all due respect, how can you possibly have a position advocating further gun control legislation without even knowing how often Americans use guns for defensive purposes? It isn't even mentioned, Lou, in articles on guns. Read an article about the Brady Bill. Go back a few years. Never will you find, well, so-and-so says that 400,000 people are still alive because of guns. My God, how can you have a rational debate without even showing the other side of the equation? And it turns out that in places like Washington, D.C., that has probably the most severe gun control of any area, this is a district, not a city, a very high per capita murder rate. You look at countries like Switzerland and like Israel, where their per capita ownership of guns is even higher than ours, a very low murder rate. Scotland, Ireland, that have very draconian gun laws, their murder rate is higher than ours. So to just blame guns and look at and dismiss every other variable is simplistic and wrongheaded.
Another sort of legal issue you look at, you call it Vietnam II.
Vietnam II is the war on drugs. We're losing the war on drugs. William F. Buckley estimates some years ago that we're spending about $200 billion in all sorts of direct and indirect costs in fighting this war on drugs. But beyond that, I own my body, not the state. And if I choose to ingest something that's stupid, that is my call, not the state. About 50% of our prison population is black. A large number of those have never committed any violent offense. They've just dealt drugs. I think we ought to deal with drugs as a health problem and not a criminal justice problem.
Larry Elder is the author of this book, The 10 Things You Can't Say in America. Next call is from Tupelo, Mississippi, on our line for Independence and Others. Good morning, Tupelo.
Hi, how you doing?
Good.
Yeah, Mr. Elder, I have to agree with you. I have to say, I want to make one comment and then ask a question. I have to say, I think that if more blacks spoke like you do, I think that there would be even less white racism, because a lot of times, a lot of the black leaders, they say things that do really add fuel. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
They incite whites, like to say every time. You know, a lot of people like Jesse Jackson or Reverend Al Sharpton, or you go on and on. It just makes us white people like me and stuff. You kind of go like, see, blacks are still complaining. You know what I'm trying to say? It's like. And I don't mean that in any kind of negative way. I mean in a positive way. It's like I think they incite people. I think it's almost like that's how they keep their jobs.
Well,
thanks a lot.
I think the caller makes a point. I've never questioned, Lou, the heart of some of the people that I've criticized. I believe that Jesse Jackson is well-intentioned. I believe that Julian Bond is well-intentioned. I question their head. Black America is quite strong. After slavery, there was virtually 100% illiteracy. Within a few decades, the overwhelming majority of blacks were able to read and write. When you look at some of the census data, it indicates that around slavery turn of the century, black child was as likely to be born in a nuclear intact family as a white child. If we were a country, we would be one of the 15 wealthiest countries in the world. We're the best educated, best fed, healthiest blacks in all of the world, and to suggest that you can't make it in America because you're black is simply inconsistent with reality. Jamaicans come over here, and Trinidadians come over here, and Nigerians come over here with very dark skin, and within 1 or 2 generations, they're out-earning the average white male in this country. So I really think that while obviously racism still exists, we're always going to have bigotry. The real problems facing the black community have very little to do with white racism. Bad schools, that's not a result of white racism. The drug problem in the inner city is not a result of white racism. The failure of businesses to start in the inner city because of a fear of crime, that has nothing to do with white racism. And so it isn't just a matter of wrong-headed analyses, Lou. It's that we're taking energy and time and effort away from spending time on problems that can and should be resolved.
Williamsburg, Virginia, you're on with Larry Elder. Good morning.
Good morning to you guys.
Good morning.
I was curious, Mr. Elder, you seem to strictly interpret the Constitution, which is fine, and less of an active role as far as the government is concerned.
Mm-hmm.
But where would you place the 54 Brown versus Board decision or the 64 Public Accommodations Bill, which at the time were considered to be active government roles? And I'm originally actually from South Carolina, and the Southern Manifesto clearly stated that the Supreme Court had overstepped its bounds. It just seems to me that strict constructionists or whatever, they seem to, I'm not sure if their argument works totally with trying to advance race or advance people. But what are your decisions on?
Well, the Brown versus Board of Education decision was, of course, right. It is unconstitutional, separate but equal, to herd blacks in certain government schools just because they're black, and whites in government schools because they're white. And obviously, it is a civil right to have any kind of government public accommodation. But I do not believe that the private sector should be governed by the government. I think any private business owner ought to be able to hire whom he wants and fire whom he wants, irrespective of race, color, and creed. If a business person consistently makes stupid decisions and hires only white males who are incompetent, A, he's going to suffer in the marketplace because I'm not going to give that business a dime, and B, he's going to suffer because he's going to have a much shallower labor pool to choose from. So I think racism doesn't sell in America. Look at what happened with Texaco when those executives were demeaning the apparently legitimate complaints of white employees at Texaco. After those tapes surfaced, Texaco lost about $1 billion in fair market value in 3 days. The CEO went on Nightline and had to apologize to America in general and to black America in particular, and offered to change the way Texaco did business. He did this not necessarily because he loved black people, although maybe he does. He did it because racism is bad for business, and the typical American will not deal with a company that is racist.
Of the 10 issues that you write about in the 10 things you can't say in America, you do single out one and call it America's greatest problem.
Yes, America's greatest problem is not crime. America's greatest problem is not drugs, although they are very severe problems. America's greatest problem is children having children. And many of the other social problems that we talk about are directly related to that. We have launched in 1965 or so under the Johnson administration the so-called war on poverty. From the turn of the century, poverty was around 70% in 1900, and it steadily declined. However, when Johnson launched the so-called war on poverty and put poverty centers and sent out a lot of people to knock on doors and tell people that they were eligible for benefits, the poverty line then began to flatline. Why? We created a whole generation of dependents, people who were dependent upon the government. What we said, and it wasn't the intention, they were very well-intentioned programs, what we said was, if you have a child, we will give you an apartment. We'll give you food stamps. We'll give you AFDC. We'll give you medical benefits. We'll give you daycare vouchers, thus making the man an economic fifth wheel and allowing him to absolve himself of his financial, fiscal, and moral responsibilities. It's been a net negative on America in general and on black America in particular.
Next call for Larry Elders from, is it Auburndale, Florida?
Yes, it sure is.
Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Elder.
Morning.
I appreciate your comments very much, and we'll have to get your book.
Thank you. Tell your friends. I get 10%.
Indeed. Today, I think we're being divided. Rather than judging individuals as individuals, I think we're being divided in this country, and of course, divide and conquer. But my big concern is the hate crime bill and putting the blacks and the handicapped on the same par as the sodomites. this really bothers me. When I worked in the prosecuting attorney's office in Indiana, the crime of sodomy was the most heinous of all crimes against mankind. And now they're trying to say that sodomy is an accepted behavior. I know a little boy that was taken from his home in Florida and put in a foster home where he was sodomized repeatedly by many different men. So this little boy, who is now a teenager, cannot even have a bowel movement, a normal bowel movement. And this, to me, is just a horrendous thing. And
well,
thanks for the call.
I'm not quite sure what she means about the sodomy stuff. It sounds to me like the young man was raped. But I will make a comment, if I could, about hate crime legislation. I'm opposed to it. I don't know very many crimes that are love crimes. I suppose if your spouse is 90 years old and connected to an IV, and the doctors won't pull the plug, and you do it anyway, and you're prosecuted for murder, I suppose that could be called a love crime. Outside of something like that, most crime that I know of is committed because somebody does not like somebody else and one wants their money or otherwise. I think it's a bizarre kind of notion. You have to get in somebody's head to determine whether or not they hit somebody as a result of that person's race, and it's entirely irrelevant. If somebody commits an act against somebody else, that person ought to be charged. Furthermore, as a percentage of the population, blacks that are roughly 10% or so commit a higher percentage of hate crimes than do whites. And you look at interracial violent crime, about 1.7 million violent acts of interracial crime in this country. About 1.2 million of them are black-white. 90% of them involve a black perpetrator and 90% involve a black victim. Now, surely some of that has to do with choosing the victim because of his race. So if you really applied the hate crime standard across the board and fairly, I think you would find that blacks as a percentage commit more hate crimes against whites than the other way around.
Oakley, Michigan. Good morning.
Good morning. Larry, you're a breath of fresh air.
Thank you.
And I'd really like to thank you for bringing this out and having the courage to come out with a book like this. I watch a lot of news, a lot of media. I'm pretty politically savvy. And what I see as a problem is the culture of political correctness just going way over to the left in the willing accomplices in the major media bringing this thing forward. And like, for instance, the Dr. Laura issue. Mm-hmm. You know, what I wonder is if there is something that people like-minded like you and I can do against the major media, against other than turning off the television. Do we change their hearts? Is there, you know, because everything you've said so far I agree wholeheartedly with.
One of your chapters is on the media.
That's right, and you're right about Dr. Laura. I've written, in fact, about the boycott against her by the gay and lesbian community because she made the remarks calling them biological defects or biological errors or something like that. And I think the remarks were ill-advised. But the attack on Dr. Laura just seems to be so out of proportion. The rapper Eminem constantly refers to homosexuals as faggots, and he doesn't seem to catch the same flack that Dr. Laura catches. And about the media, you're absolutely right. Recall Lou, George W. Bush made that remark about the New York Times reporter calling him a major league blank. Didn't realize his mic was open. And a lot of people consider that, therefore, another example of how dumb George W. Bush is. The New York Times even had a column where, an article where they said something like, while George W. Bush was frolicking at Yale, Al Gore was studying at Harvard. Well, it turns out that George W. Bush's grades were better than Al Gore's grades, and Al Gore entered a divinity school when he took 8 courses over 3 semesters and got 5 Fs, flunked out. Then he went into law school where he made mediocre grades and dropped out. George W. Bush gets an undergraduate degree from Yale and an MBA from Harvard, yet George W. Bush is a dummy and Al Gore is a scholar. It is simply unfair, and it's an image that has been perpetuated by the mainstream media.
This chapter is the third in this book. It's the media. The headline is "The Media Bias. It's Real, It's Widespread, and It's Destructive." The author of this book, Larry Elder, with us until the top of the hour. Atlanta, good morning. Georgia?
Yes, this is Georgia.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
How are you this morning?
Not too bad, sir.
You're on.
I'm on?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Let me turn my volume down. I'm a 75-year-old black man with 3 degrees. And I've had some excellent jobs in my life. Hello.
Yes, sir.
Go ahead.
I can hear you fine.
All right. And I was even a city manager at one time, so I've dealt with the whole situation from poverty, all of them. And it really just makes my conchos ache when I see
Your which ink?
conchos, right-wing black men.
I don't want that to happen.
Like you, Larry Elder. All of our lives, we have had to fight black people who have been bought. And see, you are a right-wing bigot.
Yeah.
And,
Okay,
it's nothing new. The Jews had quislings. There have always been traitors that lead the race people. See, so it just irks me to see people like you on there spouting that crap and getting rich on it.
Well, I have a couple of responses, Lou. First of all, you can see why you can't say these things in America. And also, I just find it really sad that this gentleman would not listen to what I'm saying. What I am saying is we are a mighty people. We have survived Jim Crow. We have survived slavery. The welfare state is, however, damaging us. And we've come further ahead from further behind than any race in all of human history. We have one hell of a story to tell, and much of that progress came well before affirmative action, and there's very little evidence that affirmative action accelerated it. So I am very proud of what black people have done and how black people have survived. Second, my father is 85 years old, 10 years older than the gentleman who just called. He is a child of the Depression. He grew up in the South. He was kicked out of the house when he was 13 years old. He does not know who his biological father is. When I was a child, he worked 2 jobs as a janitor, cooked for a white family on the weekend, and went to night school 4 nights a week to get his GED. My father is a lifelong Republican. Why? Because he doesn't believe in handouts. And we would sit at the dinner table every night, and my father would look at me in the eye and say, Larry, I only wish I could trade places with you. If you work hard, stick to the knitting, and stay focused, you will make it in America. And furthermore, I am not a right-winger. I am not a Republican. I'm not a Democrat. I am a registered as a decline to state, which is what you do in California, and I typically vote Libertarian. I am pro-choice. I believe that gays ought to be able to serve openly in the military. I believe that if 2 consenting adults want to get married, they ought to be able to be married, and I support the legalization of drugs and of gambling and of prostitution. Now, if that makes me a right-winger, so be it.
Larry Elder, besides being author of this book, The 10 Things You Can't Say in America, also publishes a monthly newsletter, The Elder Statement, is a syndicated columnist and the host of The Larry Elder Show on KABC Radio. When does the show air?
The show airs from 3 until 7, Monday through Friday on KABC. I also, Lou, am starting a television show on October the 2nd. It's called Moral Court. Another judge show with a black judge. No, this one has a wrinkle, and I know everybody says that, but this show is not about legal issues. They're about moral issues. A 14-year-old daughter who's 20, 30 pounds overweight takes her dad to moral court. He's about 200 pounds overweight, about morbidly obese. And he has been verbally berating his daughter's eating habits. Why? He feels that had somebody lasted him when he was her age, he might have watched his diet more and might have exercised more, and he might not be the big fat slob that he thinks he is. And so while some people may argue that it's verbal abuse, he says it's tough love. It's my job to decide who's morally right. And there are all cases like that, all classes, all ages, people with wealth, people without much wealth, people who are black, who are Hispanic, who are Asian, who are white, and it's going to be a very, very entertaining show, and I think it'll have a little content to it too.
Syndicated to local stations?
Yes, it's going to be syndicated all over. It's sold in about 90% of the country, so check your local listings.
How did it come about?
I was approached by Warner Brothers Telepictures 2 years ago, and I was asked to do this, and I said no. I said no because I have a pretty full schedule, and also I just didn't have very much respect for some of the judge shows. I don't watch much television, and to the extent that I did, I just didn't think much of them. And then when the concept became clearer and clearer to me, and they came back 2 more times over the course of the next 2 years, I then sat down and I said, this one is different. Maybe I can say some things that are kind of meaningful without detracting from the entertainment value.
Larry Elder was born and raised in South Central Los Angeles, has a BA in Political Science from Brown University, has a degree in laws from the University of Michigan, and was a practicing trial lawyer before becoming involved in the media. Tiqua, Oklahoma is on the Republican line. Good morning.
It's Tiqua, Ohio.
I'm sorry. Go right ahead.
Mr. Elder, I read your book. I'm not a book buyer, and I bought your book, and I was really loved it. My sons are reading it. My husband's reading it, and we talk about it constantly around the dinner table.
Well, thank you. I just did a book signing in New York, and a young man who's in high school came up, and he said the same thing. I don't normally read books, and he said, I picked it up, and I could not put it down. And I know this is very self-serving, but I intentionally tried to write the book in a relaxed, readable style so people could understand it, so it wouldn't be too heavy. And I have a very extensive index, as you know. So if you want to do some follow-up to find out where I get my stats and my graphs from, where is the basis for my arguments, you can do that.
Well, I am a small business owner. My husband and I own a small business. Your chapter on the healthcare crisis, so-called healthcare crisis, was so on the mark. As a small business owner and watching these presidential debates about giving away more Medicare, who's going to pay for that? Small business is going to pay for it. We cannot even afford medical insurance. I have to take 3 hours a day out of our business time and work in a school cafeteria so that I can have the privilege of buying medical benefits for my husband and I through our school board. People don't realize somebody has to pay the tab. The government gives nobody anything. Somebody
pays. Economics 101, there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. And one of the fundamental problems in this country is that most people haven't had any economics. It's not that difficult. I wish it were required in high schools, because if it were, people wouldn't be misled into buying so many things that simply make things worse. Minimum wage being one of them. Minimum wage actually shuts out those who are the most in need of jobs. Rent control. Rent control makes it more expensive for somebody poor to get an apartment. Fundamental Economics 101 teaches you supply and demand, teaches you how prices are set, teaches you how the higher the taxes are, the less people will work and the more they will conceal their income. And so it's very, very critical to understand in the healthcare debate, there is no such thing as a free lunch. Somebody will pay.
Santa Fe, California, good morning.
Good morning. Are you there?
Yes.
We are.
Yes, Larry Elder, I just want to say you've been very inspirational to me over the years. I saw you at the Libertarian Convention. And I just love your viewpoints on the Constitution and on the drug war, which I think a lot of people aren't addressing these days. And I think the drug war has a lot to do with the racism questions that everybody's bringing up all the time.
I think you're right. I think you're right. Especially the argument of DWB, driving while black. So many black people are arguing that the police intentionally pull them over, and I don't doubt that some do, for no other reason than they're black. But much of DWB and much of the friction between blacks and the police has to do with the war on drugs, with the police officers looking for drug possessors and drug dealers. If we again called off the war on drugs and treated it as a health problem rather than as a criminal justice problem, much of the friction between blacks and the police would go away.
Oryxburg, Pennsylvania. Good morning.
Yes, Mr. Elder. It's really a pleasure to hear you talk, and I do not agree with all what you're saying, but I will say this. My wife came to a correlation, probably 2 years ago, that we have managed to get away from several plantations to one plantation, which is the Democratic Party. And I think that they criticize us if we have something different to say, if we don't follow the line that they think we should follow. And that's not what it's all about. We're taught to make what we can of ourselves. And I agree. I think the welfare program has kind of made us dependent on the government. And I resent that anymore. Thank you.
Well, you're quite welcome. It's tough for Republicans, because Republicans, if they really are going to walk the walk, they mean you've got to cut things down. When you cut things down, that means people are going to have programs taken away from them, and that's always very difficult. But Democrats do have the image and the attitude that they're on the side of the angels. When Dick Morris was interviewed some years back, he was asked about Bill Clinton's core principles. The argument was that Clinton was a slickster and had no core principles. And Dick Morris says, "Oh no, yes he does." When he was running against Bob Dole, he called me and he said, "Dick, what Bob Dole wants to do to women and children is evil. What Bob Dole wants to do to old people is evil. Let's get that straight." Now, Bob Dole is a man who fought in the Second World War, almost lost his life when, in a very heroic measure, he was on a mine and blew off half his body. And you may have an argument against Bob Dole or against the Republican Party, but to call them evil because they do not feel that big government works is just so patently unfair. Yet those kinds of statements are made routinely and are not very often challenged.
We've talked to several callers who talked about the parties. One of your chapters is about Democrats and Republicans.
Right. I make the argument, Lou, that there is very little difference between the two parties. Now, there certainly are differences. When you look at Al Gore's platform and George W. Bush's platform, Al Gore calls for much, much bigger government. But unfortunately, George W. Bush's platform calls for an expansion of government, although at a lesser rate. But when you consider how I feel about the Constitution and how I feel about the fundamental principles of the government, neither party is very satisfying. There was a time during the Ronald Reagan era when the Republican Party was pushing for the abolition of the Departments of Energy, Commerce, and Education. No more. There was a time when the Republican Party resisted efforts to expand things like Head Start, like Title I, neither of which works. Now George W. Bush is talking about expanding Head Start. So as far as I'm concerned, a pox on both their houses. When George W. Bush gave his acceptance speech in Philadelphia, he said no American should pay more than 30% of his income in income taxes. 30%? I think the number should be closer to, I don't know, 0. Originally, the founders wanted the fundamental duties of the government to be funded by duties and tariffs. And so to have a Republican say that no one should pay more than 30% of his taxes, federal income taxes, is a far, far cry from where I think the Founding Fathers intended the government to be.
Killeen, Texas. Good morning.
Hi, how you doing?
Hi.
My name's Jones. I was just wondering, what do you think about the federal government sponsoring media stations when they put out the so-called news? What they do is they put out these news stories where they are deceptive, they twist the truth, they put out the kind of news that the government in charge wants them to put out, so that the story that they do end up putting out on the news is a far cry from the truth.
Well, I don't believe that news directors and news people are led around by some sort of memo or there's some sort of massive conspiracy. What I mean when I talk about the liberal bias in the media is that most reporters are in fact liberal. You look at a Gannett-sponsored poll that was taken back in 1996. Washington, D.C. reporters were asked, for whom did you vote in 1992? 47% of Americans voted for Bill Clinton. Reporters, 89% did. 43% voted for his Republican opponent. 7% of Washington, D.C. reporters did. About a third of all Americans describe themselves as conservatives. The Washington, D.C. Poll indicated that only 2% describe themselves as conservative. Now, unless they really are automatons and can somehow divorce their emotion from their writing, I don't know how that can't seep into their writing. Frequently, you look at articles on gun control, and it's not uncommon for people like Wayne LaPierre of the NRA or Charlton Heston of the NRA to be referred to as lobbyists. But Sarah Brady of Handgun Control, Inc., also a 501c3 nonprofit, as is the NRA, is frequently referred to as an advocate. And these are the kinds of subtle things that reporters do that indicate their bias. And again, I don't believe it's intentional. I don't believe there's some sort of plot. But it does distort the news. And if you're reading a column, it kind of subliminally, the word that George W. Bush couldn't pronounce yesterday, and I couldn't just now, influences you. And those are the kinds of things that I mean about the media bias.
After folks read this book, what do you want them to think or do or act on? What should be the result of reading this?
I hope that people will begin taking a look at both parties and deciding whether or not both parties are, in fact, doing the kinds of things that make America better. I want people to wonder, why is it that we spend so much money on welfare when 70 cents out of the dollar never makes it down to the intended beneficiary? I want people to wonder whether or not, if they had their own money back, and given the tremendous generosity of the American people, wouldn't it be better to give the money to something like United Way, where I worked one summer when I was practicing law, or Salvation Army? In those organizations, 95 cents of the dollar gets down to the intended beneficiary, as opposed to only 30 cents on the dollar when the federal government does it. So even if you argue that we need to have some sort of social safety net, and I certainly feel that way, that social safety net ought to be provided by people helping people, not government helping people.
Larry Elder is the host of the Larry Elder Show on KABC Radio in Los Angeles and the author of The 10 Things You Can't Say in America. Thanks very much.
Thank you for having me. That flew by.
It did. We're going to take a short break and then be back with Sue Bailey. She's the administrator of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. We're going to talk about tires. We'll be right back.
This Sunday on Book TV, James